Beethoven's sonatas are perhaps amongst the best known pieces of music in the world, and the Adagios especially are very popular with the amateur pianists. So today I'd like to take you through the Adagio of Sonata Pathétique. As always, I've created a free set of practice notes that you can download, so you don't need to worry about taking any notes while you're watching this video. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Now, the sheet music for this is available free of charge from IMSLP, and there are lots of different editions, and it's well worth taking a little bit of time to find the one that you like the most. Now, one thing it's probably worth pointing out is that you will come across different ways in different editions that this is notated. As you can see below at the beginning, for example, sometimes we have the 16th notes written in the bass clef, so in the left-hand clef, and just the melody written in the treble clef for the right. And in others, you'll see that the right hand is notated in the bass clef and contains both the melody and the accompaniment notes. And the intention in either case is that the right hand takes all of these notes. You'll also notice different non-legato markings, as you can see in the examples I put on the screen here for you. So let's jump into how we might go about learning this. As always, we'll use my 4-step method of discover, divide, conquer, and integrate to learn this. In terms of discover, the first thing I'd recommend, of course, is listening to this piece played by pianists that you like. Now, for me, I love the way Barenboim plays Beethoven, but if you prefer Lang Lang, then by all means listen to him. However, don't limit yourself to just one recording. If you listen to a few great pianists play this, you'll see that they have very different views on dynamics, on use of pedal, on where it's going to be non-legato, and don't be afraid to make the piece your own, just as they've done. The second step of my 4-step process is that of divide. In terms of dividing the piece, for me, it has 6 main sections based on the material, and you'll find the full breakdown in the practice notes. And I'd recommend learning this section by section. When I learn a piece, I don't initially practice an entire section from the get-go. I actually break it right down into what I call segments or longer phrases, and then those segments into snippets, which are the smallest building blocks that it's possible to practice sensibly. Here I've stuck mostly with the individual phrases to define my snippets. This breakdown is in the free practice notes for you. So let's look at this first section. One thing you might notice about it is that it's remarkably similar in structure to the main theme of Chopin's Etude No. 3 in E Opus 10, often known as Triplets, of course. We have a cantabile melody. Note the piece is marked as Adagio cantabile anyway. A 16th note accompaniment to be played in the right hand underneath the melody, and a bass line to be played by the left hand. So here, the challenge will be making this melody sing above a nicely controlled accompaniment in the same way we need to do with Triplets. And the reason I mention the Chopin Etude is that Alfred Cortot produced an edition of these etudes where he included a whole raft of preparatory exercises to help students develop the skills necessary to play the studies themselves. So a great starting place can be to inspire ourselves from his exercises for Triplets, which I've talked about before in the video linked here. Now, like this Adagio, the opening theme of Triplets doesn't look all that difficult, and it can often be a temptation to just jump straight into learning the notes so we can get to the harder parts. However, I think it's worth doing a little more preparatory work first. Cortot tells us that to produce the effect we need, it's all about controlling the weight of the hand so that we maintain the cantabile not by striking the key with force, but by using natural weight. He also talks about splitting the hand into 2, with the weaker fingers using more weight and the stronger fingers using less. However, being able to switch between the 2 at will. So before starting to practice the notes themselves, let's do a little work with these exercises. In the practice notes, I've transcribed 5 of them for you across the 3 major chords in this harmony. My advice would be, if you find these exercises easy to play, then move on to the notes. If, however, you find them a little awkward, then spend some time working on them as part of your regular practice of this piece. Next, we're ready to think about moving into the notes themselves. So let's look in more detail about how we can practice the snippets of our first segment. As a general rule, when we're working on a section, we spend just the time necessary in each snippet. Any that we feel are easy to play, then there's not need to keep repeating them. However, any that we find more awkward, we will spend more time on them and just use a wider variety of practice methods. Again, we can inspire ourselves from Cortot and use the method he suggests. And this is effectively to double up the accompaniment notes. So rather than using 16th notes, let's convert them to 32nd notes, but we'll play the melody more slowly so that these don't become rushed. As we practice, we need to be thinking weight into the melody note and lightness into the accompanying notes. We can also use two different articulations to practice. We can practice the accompaniment staccato, and we can then practice it legato. Remember here, the major thing we're trying to achieve is to develop this split between the melody and the accompaniment. So on this basis, I limit practicing like this to just maybe the first 2 or 3 snippets, but maybe spend the time it takes on just these snippets until it feels second nature almost to gain that control. The second segment of this section moves the melody up an octave and introduces a 16th note accompaniment in the left hand as well as the right. Here we can use the same practice method, that of doubling up the accompaniment notes like this. Again, perhaps do this just for the first couple of snippets until it feels easy. Once we're there, we can move on to practicing these snippets as written. And I do this snippet by snippet at first before starting to build these into the longer segments. Again, all of this breakdown is in the practice notes. My advice is to not rush this process. Don't add 2 snippets or more together until you really feel control of each individual one. You might find, for example, that the little stretch in measure 3 where we have a B flat played by the pinky, followed closely by an A flat an octave lower to be played by the thumb, takes longer to control the weight. So don't be afraid to keep work on it alone until you're 100% happy with it. Once you've put this entire section together, here's a great power tip for you. In order to get a really good feeling for the pulse, try playing along to one of your favourite recordings. Now, the objective isn't actually to achieve a 100% match. Rather, it's to get a strong internal feeling for how the pianist plays with or without rubato, how the dynamic lines are working. Of course, don't overdo this, perhaps just do it a couple of times and see if it feels slower or faster than how your internal clock might feel it. Perhaps eventually you'll settle on a slower or a quicker tempo for yourself, but you'll first have a feel for it. Now let's think about the second section. Here, Beethoven initially switches to a singing melody played above repeated chords in the left hand, not unlike Chopin's E minor prelude, in fact. Here then, our challenge is going to be getting those repeated chords nice and light and keeping our left hand relaxed. Again, we work snippet by snippet, just spending the time we need on each. One trick here is to actually start out doing the opposite of what we might eventually want to achieve. So when working on the first couple of snippets of this section, play the left hand chords heavily and confidently. I got this tip from William Westney's The Perfect Wrong Note. And basically let your left hand really sink into the shape of those chords. However, don't keep pushing down into the key bed. As soon as the chord's been sounded, then the hand needs to be relaxed and simply resting on the key bed, ready to be lifted again. And then let's try to lighten our touch. I've seen teachers recommend keeping fingers locked when repeating chords. However, I personally find it's more effective to think of them becoming active at the point of striking a chord and then to become immediately passive again. The reason is that it's not my fingers that are going to lift themselves here, it's my hand that will lift my fingers from the keys, and only at the point of dropping them back down again do I need to make sure they're active enough to play all of the notes together. Now let's focus on those snippets with the ornaments. My first recommendation here would be not to rush these. Work out precisely how you want to play them first. So if we look at this turn, where exactly do we want to place it against the accompanying chords? It can sometimes be helpful to quickly write it out in a notebook to help us when practicing. You might want to start out a little under tempo when practicing this. However, depending on how you want to time it, you might find that speeding it up really isn't that much of a challenge. Next we have this snippet, which is perhaps the most complicated part of the entire piece in terms of notes and rhythms. Again, we can write out the first turn in a notebook to ensure we have a clear idea of how we want to play it. And we can also ignore the rests in the left hand and instead replace them with chords. Now I say this because I initially found that I was never confident I was respecting the pulse and that I was sort of scrambling around for the notes. Thus, to keep myself anchored, initially practicing by maintaining the repeated chords helped me to internalize it. I also found this helped when joining this snippet to the next. Again, rather than playing a single chord with rest, I kept the pulse going by repeating that E-flat chord in the 16th note. So when the right hand picks up, it maintains that same pulse. Once this feels completely easy to do, we can then remove those additional chords. In the remaining snippets of this section, I feel that we can give a little more spotlight to those 16th notes. So here we might want to practice using less weight on the chord and more to the 16th notes underneath. The next little section is simply a reprise of the initial theme, pretty much note for note, so I'll not talk about it any further here. Given we've already practiced it, we can hopefully just play through. Our next section shifts into A-flat minor. Our accompaniment also moves from normal 16th notes into 16th note triplets. Again, what we need to work on here is keeping the melody nice and clear over the soft chords underneath. You might find it helpful to initially practice using staccato chords under a legato melody to help with the separation of the two. You may find measure 38 a little tricky, depending on the size of your hands. I find it extremely uncomfortable and unreliable to try and play the D-flat, E-flat with 1 and 2 whilst playing the higher D-flat with 5. I therefore opted to play these lower notes with my thumb only. If you find the same applies to you, it's worth practicing just that shift alone, as it will likely feel odd at first. The next snippets bring in some octaves. Now, when I first worked on these, I used to jump between them. Given that we're moving from one chord to another, this was my instinctive reaction to playing them. However, if we look more closely, a much more reliable way to play them is to actually use the thumb on the note immediately before the octave, because it automatically brings us into place and removes the jump altogether. There is, after all, no need to make life any more difficult than it needs to be. The only thing I'd add about the remainder of this section is the staccato left hand. You might choose to play this with or without pedal. Maintaining the articulation even when the pedal's down does change the sound, so one's not necessarily incompatible with the other. You might choose to practice it both ways so you can mix and match at will later. Our next section brings back the main theme, but this time with those 16th notes as triplets still. In terms of practice methods, we should now have spent enough time working on separating our hand between melody and accompaniment that we're okay to start working through this snippet by snippet as written. However, it's perhaps worth thinking about our interpretation a little more here. You might notice how some of the triplets are given a staccato, so we need to think how we wish to use the pedal. I'd anyway be inclined to pedal each melody note, however we could either fully or partially lift it for the final two of the triplets. This is why working snippet by snippet is still important, as we're trying to determine the detail of the pedal as well as the notes themselves. I'm not going to say what's right or wrong here. Barenboim does let these sound staccato by releasing the pedal, yet other excellent pianists leave the pedal down. It's always worth exploring both options. To practice the final section, we've already covered all the techniques needed. Again, we might choose to write out the ornaments in a notebook to help us. It's always worth considering whether we want to play the two black keys with the thumb again here. In this instance, I can manage either. You might also want to try playing along with your favourite recording again here. It's a good double check in terms of pulse. You might find you've gone much faster or slower here, which of course might be what you're after. Don't forget you can download my practice notes from the link in the description below. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me a comment and I'll do my best to answer. Just let me add a few words about integrating this here. We should of course be integrating each section as we progress. First integrating the snippets into segments and then the segments into the section. We then of course need to finally integrate the sections themselves. Often it can help to integrate 2 sections at a time, then 3 at a time, then 4 at a time. I think this step is where I have made the most mistakes in the past, and this is going from lots of smaller parts into one larger part. In my experience, this rarely works, and spending an additional day or 2 integrating more gradually always pays dividends. You'll see suggestions for this in the practice notes. If you enjoyed this tutorial, then don't forget to subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner and click the little bell icon so you're notified of new videos like this as and when they're released. I do thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.